Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the final part of C.O.P.S Week. Today, we take a look at all 15 issues of C.O.P.S, the comic book. Today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Well, I'm willing to bet a lot of you out there probably didn't even know there was a C.O.P.S comic book. Well, there was. It ran for a total of 15 issues, was published by DC Comics 1988 to 1989, same season as the TV show. It debuted around the same time as the TV show and ended around the same time as the TV show. Even though there was 15 issues, and you may be thinking, hey, doesn't 1 year of a comic usually mean 12 issues? Well, yes, it does. Except this particular year, DC was publishing a few extra issues in, I believe, the winter months. 4 issues that came out between December and January. So, yeah, it must have been fun to work for DC that year, having to work a lot of overtime, I bet. Now, I've always been a big fan of comics based on toy properties. I don't know why. There's just something about them that's always appealed to me. Possibly because one of the very first comic books I really remember reading as a kid was one called Shogun Warriors, which, here's a look at the first issue of Shogun Warriors. Shogun Warriors was based on a line of action figures that were obviously inspired by several Japanese action figures at the time. It was one of the first attempts to really bring a Japanese-inspired line of toys over to North America. And anyway, there was a comic book series published about it, which I really enjoyed. For the longest time, I only had the first 3 issues, and I reread those first 3 issues so many times. And of course, issue 3 left off with a killer cliffhanger, so I was like dying to know what happened for years, until finally I managed to get my hands on the rest of the set, and I now have all 20 issues. At some point I'll do a video about Shogun Warriors. But the funny thing is, one of the connections between Shogun Warriors and C.O.P.S is one that I actually didn't expect, namely that they are both written by the same guy, namely Doug Moench, who is a writer who's been around seemingly since the dawn of time. I mean, as long as I can remember reading comics, I would often see his name in the writer's credits. Another series I really enjoyed of his was one called 6 from Sirius, and its sequel, 6 from Sirius 2. They were 2 4-part miniseries published by Marvel's Epic Comics line back in the 80s, and featuring beautiful, beautiful painted artwork by Paul Gulacy, who was a frequent collaborator with Doug. Now, one of the things I've always found really interesting about comic books based on toys, where there's also a cartoon series at the same time, is to see the difference in tone and storylines and characterizations and whatnot between the comics and the cartoon. The biggest example of this I can think of would be G.I. Joe, where fans of G.I. Joe are quite aware of the very major differences between the comic and the show. In that case, you know, the storylines tended to be a lot edgier, characters would die, and also some of the character dynamics were different. Like, for example, in the comic of G.I. Joe, General Hawk was the leader pretty much the whole time, whereas in the show it was primarily Duke, and then General Hawk came in later. Yeah, so there was a lot of discrepancies. A lot of people will tell you, without any fear of contradiction, that the comic is definitely the better of the two in terms of writing and story arcs and whatnot, but they still like the show anyway for its cheesiness and whatnot. And I tend to agree with that. Now, in the case of C.O.P.S, it's much the same situation. While C.O.P.S never really got the chance to develop as deeply as G.I. Joe did, G.I. Joe went on for 150 some odd issues and has been revived a number of times. C.O.P.S, basically you got the 15 issues and that's it. And then of course the 65 episodes of the TV show. But that said, I think fans of the cartoon would definitely find the comic book interesting for those differences. So once again, I've done high-res scans for you, so you can get a nice, clear, crisp, clean, beautiful, high-def look at the covers. So let's start running the covers there. There we go. And then we'll talk a little bit about the comics, shall we? Now, one of the stories I was particularly interested in doing a direct comparison between was the origin story. Now, of course, in the cartoon, the origin story appears a little bit later in the series as Case of Cops File Number 1. I should mention, a lot of fans are like, why wasn't the origin story put at the beginning of Volume 1 of the cartoon? And it's like, well, because that's not where it's supposed to be. If you listen to the opening narration of that episode, Bulletproof himself says, this information has been kept classified until now, when the story can finally be told. So the whole idea is to start you in the middle of the action with just some typical cops adventures and then tell you the origin story later. You know, kind of like Star Wars did with the prequels. Yeah, that's sort of the idea with Cops. It's supposed to be later in the series. Anyway, with the comic book, they started right in with the origin story. Almost right off the bat, you notice some serious differences between it and the cartoon. For example, a few big ones that spring to mind immediately. We all know that Berserko is Big Boss's nephew. Now, in the cartoon, you never really find out much about Big Boss's brother, Berserko's father. However, in the comic, you know, within a few pages, you've got some pretty interesting backstory there. First off, Big Boss keeps a picture on his desk of his brother, and Berserko, all this time, thought that it was a picture of Big Boss himself. He just had a picture of himself on his desk. But it turns out that Big Boss's brother was actually his twin brother. And here's where it gets interesting. Federal agent B.P. Vest, this is long before he became Bulletproof, busted Big Boss's brother and sent him to jail. And he died in jail. And that's why Berserko is staying with Big Boss now. So basically, this becomes some serious motivation for Big Boss hating B.P. Vest so much, because he totally blames him for the death of his twin brother. That's something you never found out in the cartoon, is it? Something else is a little bit different, specifically the origin of B.P. Vest. In the show, he actually gets buried under a bunch of rubble and then hospitalized because of that. And then they say, well, you'll never be able to walk again unless we replace your body with cybernetic parts. It's like, okay, cool. So he decides to undergo the surgery so that he can, you know, be functional again and start the cops team to fight the crooks, Big Boss and his gang. In the comic, however, it plays out a little bit differently. First off, he isn't buried under rubble. He's actually in the middle of an investigation, and he's going into a building where, unbeknownst to him, the crooks have actually planted a bomb. He opens the door to this room, and then the bomb goes off, like as soon as he opens the door, and he gets hit full in the face and body and everything, full body, top to bottom, with this massive fiery explosion. The next thing you see is he's in the hospital, covered head to foot in bandages, barely alive, and the doctors are saying not that he'll never walk again if they don't operate, but rather that he will die unless they operate really, really soon. So, so the only option is basically to undergo the surgery and get the cybernetic body and everything. The end result ends up being the same, but the path getting there is a lot more intense. Another thing that I noticed in the comic book is they take a lot more time to flesh out the characters and give the characters more backstory. So even though you're introduced to all the various team members of the cops in the first issue, the primary plot actually follows B.P. Vest coming to Empire City to help out with the crime problem and teaming up with the local police, specifically with P.J. O'Malley. P.J. O'Malley, of course, becomes Long Arm later on. Now, we find out a lot more about P.J. O'Malley and his background. Now, some of this is touched on in the show, but we get a lot more sort of, I guess, emotional content with the comic book version, because P.J. O'Malley comes from a long line of cops. His father was a cop, his father's father was a cop, and his father is very much an old-fashioned cop, likes to do things the old-fashioned way, rely on instinct, and, you know, not rely on high-tech gadgets so much. And he's really tried to impart that old-school sensibility and set of values of what it means to be a good cop in his son. And his son is trying to carry on the tradition in this, you know, fairly high-tech world now, where a lot of police work is done using high-tech gadgets and whatnot. He tries to do as much as he can the old-fashioned way. and not relying too heavily on the technology that a lot of a lot of other cops do. Now that's actually and this is one of the things that plays out in the comic as him and Vess are working together in the initial, before the explosion, before, the formation of the C.O.P.S team. They're just sort of investigating the crooks goings on. That's one of the things that Vess really likes about O'Malley, is the fact that O'Malley is an old-fashioned cop and relies on instinct and stuff. They butt heads quite a bit at the beginning because he sees Vess as just coming in and taking over, whereas really why Vess is there is he's trying to put together a team to deal with the crooks, because the crooks are basically running the town. One of the things I really like about the comic is how that whole relationship plays out, and how over the course of their working together on this investigation, they really gain a mutual respect for each other. There's a lot of little touches in there, and this is one of the things that Doug Moyink's always been really good at, is just little character touches that just add more layers to, peeling the layers of the onion, so to speak. They add more layers to the onion of character development. And one of the things I really liked that was sort of a recurring theme in the story was when VP Vess is talking to O'Malley about the importance of good solid police work and such, and knowing whether or not to trust somebody, because there's trust issues initially because they don't really know each other and stuff. And he says, the best way to know someone is to look them in the eye and shake their hand. That's how I like to judge people and determine whether or not there's somebody that I can rely on. So VP Vess very much has some old-fashioned values as well, and I think that's sort of the inroads for O'Malley's respect of him, because as he realizes, okay, this big bad federal agent, but he's got these old-fashioned qualities I can dig. Fast forward to a little later when VP Vess is in the hospital bed, the doctors are insisting that they operate, and he's saying, no, not yet, I need to talk to O'Malley. So he talks to O'Malley, and he tells him, he says, yeah, I want to put together a team to deal with the crooks. I want you on that team. And he hands him a list of names. He says, here's a list of names of other people that I think might be good for the team. I want you to go out and talk to them, look them in the eye, and shake their hand. I trust your judgment. I mean, what a great sort of way to bring that all together. It's like just really solidifies their bond there. And O'Malley, of course, readily accepts. And then another thing that he does is gives O'Malley a code to put into the police computer. And his own file comes up, like O'Malley's file comes up with all his accomplishments as a cop and such over the years. And he's like, what the hell, you already knew who I was. Why did you need to test me and whatnot? And he says, because, like I told you, you can know everything about a man, but you don't really know him until you look him in the eye and shake his hand. So there was a lot of nice little ways that was all kind of brought together. Overall, the origin story, the end result ends up being the same, but like I said, the road getting there is different, and I think in some ways actually better than the way it played out in the cartoon, just because it gives more depth to the characters and such, and I really like that a lot. One of the other differences, and this is kind of a minor thing, is in the cartoon when O'Malley's actually going out to recruit everybody, he just sort of checks them out on the computer with the assistance of mainframe. We get a little montage of what they can do and stuff. But in the comic book, he actually physically goes to wherever they are so that he can look them in the eye and shake their hand. And it makes it more personal. Plus, also the things that they're doing to sort of demonstrate their abilities are different in the comic than what you see in the cartoon. In some ways, they actually come off as a bit more badass in the comic than they do in the cartoon, too. In terms of just sort of overall edginess compared to the cartoon, there is a little bit of that. For example, they can swear a little bit in the comics that they obviously couldn't in the cartoons. They say damn and hell sometimes, which I think just helps to make them a little bit more human. But yeah, overall, considering it's a comic book series based on toys, I think they did a great job of making it as human as they could, and having lots of good emotional character moments while still maintaining a lot of the lighthearted tone. The crooks in the comic definitely seem to pose more of an actual threat than they do in the cartoon. In the cartoon they're always kind of goofy, and there's not really any real danger other than sort of cartoony mayhem that they cause. In the comics, they can be pretty scary. In particular, Buttons McBoom Boom, who from the cartoon is kind of like borderline psycho. Well, they really play that up a lot more in the comic. For example, in the second issue, the C.O.P.S team is fairly new. The crooks want to send a message to them. So they actually send out Buttons to go to O'Malley's home and terrorize his family. O'Malley's dad lives with them in the comic, and as well as his wife and son. So O'Malley goes off to work and tells his son to look after everybody while he's gone. Buttons McBoom Boom shows up after dark and just lays waste to the whole frickin' place. He just shows up and just unloads with like this machine gun and terrorizes the hell out of the family. Destroys the dad's wheelchair. The kid's like gonna be traumatized. The wife's in tears, and it's just horrific. Like, that's something you would never see in the show. But I think it's great, because I always thought Buttons was a pretty cool character. You could totally see him as the cold, calculating assassin type. So, there you go. That's basically the C.O.P.S comic book in a nutshell. If you like the show, I would definitely recommend picking it up. I'm sure you can find the issues on eBay fairly cheap. C.O.P.S, the comic book, gets my seal of approval. And, you know, if you're familiar with the cartoon and you love the characters like I do, and you want sort of a fresh take on them and some new stories that you may not have experienced before, check out the comics. You can't go wrong. Alright, that's it from me to you for now. So until next time, sayonara.